For those of you that may not know me, I'm Al Duffy. I'm the president of this amazing organization. And thank you all for coming. I'm just going to make some introductory comments and turn it over to the people that know the details. So what we're looking at, you could call this a presentation, call it a reveal, but this is the newest addition to our collection. And it's amazing. I mean, it's a GM made by General Motors here in Oshawa in September 1943. Now, if I do the math, that means that it's now here 80 years after it was produced. 80 years. Now, we do have other vehicles in the collection that were made in Oshawa. I mean, and they're amazing. They're really interesting things. But they never left Canada. The ironic part is this vehicle, and this is what makes it so rare. This vehicle that was produced in September 1943, shortly after its production, was shipped over to Italy and joined the Canadian Armed Forces there, and then was with the Canadian Army fighting throughout the war. Now, at the end of the war, vehicles weren't brought back. The war was over, the crisis was over, they just weren't brought back. We have two Shermans right there. Well, they're built in the US, but they were never sent overseas. Canada bought, I think it was 250 or 260 of these from the Americans, but never went overseas. They never fought. And yet, these are the ones we have. We don't have the other, because they didn't bring them back. This we were able to get back here, and I'll leave that story for someone else. But I mean, it's this was used by Canada throughout the war. This was it was designed after a British thing, and this is Canadian and the adaptation and of how we did it here in Oshawa in 1943. And I don't know if any of us were working in the plant at that time. I know I wasn't. I can remember when I finished university, my first job was with General Motors. It was in the North Main office. And you walked in there, and it was right near the elevators. They had pictures of all the vehicles they produced in World War II. They had them on the wall, and this was one of them. And some of you may have seen that there's pictures of the North Main office, and there's several of these, exactly these, parked right out front. Now, we don't know if this was one of those several that were in the picture, but it's not relevant. So anyways, what I'd like to do then is, again, thank you so much for coming. And I'd like to turn this over to our Executive Director, Jeremy Blowers, who will MC the rest of this event.
Thanks so much, Al. An exciting day in Oshawa. And Al was talking about his personal stories, personal connection to General Motors. And really, if you live in Oshawa, if you grew up in Oshawa or around Oshawa, you have some relationship with the history of General Motors. I myself, in university and right after university, I was working in the automotive industry, helping build cars here in Oshawa for General Motors. And so many of the members of this museum, members of the Ontario Regiment, have some sort of connection to General Motors. But today is a special day where we look back at our history and that continuity between the Second World War, the 1940s, and 80 years later into the 21st century. So we have a lot of VIPs here today. I'm just going to mention some groups. Welcome to many city councillors from the city of Oshawa, members of General Motors of Canada, including the Retirees Association, both the Hourly Retirees Association and the Salaried Employees Association. We actually have a visitor here from Italy, from CRCS Onlus Museum. Ilya, are you in the crowd here yet? You text me that you're around the corner. Okay. Who is currently working in Toronto, and that's the museum where this came from, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. We also have members of the Dunkley Charitable Foundation here, the Dunkley family, who made this possible, and we'll hear from Brad Dunkley later on, and also members of the regiment, the regimental family, and the museum. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. So there's so many interesting stories about every single vehicle in this museum. They tell someone's story of service, sacrifice. They tell the stories of ingenuity, of design, of challenge. But this one particular artifact that we're presenting today brings together a continuity of many different histories. So it is our military history. It is our national history and how our nation rose to a challenge in a difficult time in a world crisis. It is our social history, how industrialization changed our society. It's also a testament to Canadian design, ingenuity, productivity, and the battle that was fought on the home front here during the Second World War. It is one of only 7 examples that still exist of the General Motors Fox. There was 1,506 of these produced, and as Al said, none of them came home. The only examples that we can find in North American museums, and there are very few, there's only 7 in the world, are those that did not make it overseas, and most of them are not fully operational and running like this one is. So it makes it exceptionally rare in the world of military vehicles and for those in the collections department of museums, but it's special to Oshawa, and it's incredibly special to us. Most people in their study of the Second World War, you mostly hear the headlines about great battles, generals, strategy, bombing, air campaigns. The Second World War was a war of the factories. It was a war of production on the home front to outproduce and better produce the vehicles needed to win that conflict and save lives. And speaking of that, I'd like to introduce Thorsten Koseck, who is the plant director of Oshawa Assembly from General Motors of Canada. Come on up.
Thank you, Jeremy, and also want to say thank you to the entire Ontario Regiment Museum. It kind of brings shivers when you walk around this place and you realize these vehicles and what they meant to the country, but not to the entire United Nations. And because of these vehicles and the people that served in these vehicles, the sacrifices they made, we are here today. And it just really makes you feel heartwarmed that this exists here in Oshawa. So I feel very privileged, and I want to say thank you to the many volunteers. I know it takes hundreds and thousands of hours to be able to put this together and keep these vehicles running. So truly keep our history here, keep it here in Oshawa. What you're doing is extremely important. So my name is Thorsten Koseck. I'm the plant director here in Oshawa Assembly. And we're honored here today to celebrate this remarkable piece of history, the GM Armored Fox car. This vehicle, as Jeremy said, was manufactured in 1943 and is a great example of what Canadian pride and what Canadianship can do. The men and women that built this vehicle is just truly amazing. The factory here in Oshawa that produced the last vehicle back in 1942 when it switched from passenger-making vehicles to armored vehicles in 1943. So in less than 1 year, we turned a whole factory around, the people back then, to produce wartime equipment. We produced things like artillery, trucks, ambulances, tractors, gun carriages, tank hulls, fuselages for the Mosquito light bomber, and including the Fox. It was remarkable. In just 1 year, GM of Canada plant was able to retool, prepare an entire building, and ship these vehicles across the world. Although employees never handled such equipment or weapons, I can guarantee you that everyone involved rallied around to support Canada and its troops. We actually traveled back then to different factories to benchmark on how to build these vehicles to ensure the safety of the people that were using them. And that same practice actually occurs today. We still do benchmarking around the world, different factories to ensure that the vehicles we produce are the best and for the safety of our customers. I can doubly credit the thinking of the Oshawa team I've seen firsthand with our employees. In November 2021, we retooled a factory, the fastest launch in General Motors history, to build light-duty and heavy-duty trucks. To this day, the only factory that's capable to do that. No small task. And I cannot even relate to the task it took the team back in 1943 to convert the entire factory. On top of that, the people are just absolutely fantastic. And you can see that in that short period, the attitude of the people, and really has that can-do, will-do attitude that we see here today. And it clearly is the test of time. It was back then, and we see it here today. The GM Fox armored vehicle is a symbol of General Motors' commitment to innovation, adaptability to the GM community, to the Oshawa community, and to the people that served. These were our strengths then, and it is today. Thank you for being and remembering our past. Celebrate today. We have a strong future. So just want to remember the people that built the vehicle, and more importantly, the people that served in this vehicle to give us the freedoms we have today. Thank you.
So before we get to our next speaker, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the vehicle because so little is known. When I first heard that this vehicle was available and we were investigating it, I immediately started a search. I knew about the vehicle, obviously, but the amount of research and information that was available online is almost nothing. It was like there's 2 paragraphs of Wikipedia, and every website just cut and pasted them. So we had to do a lot of deep research into the vehicle, how it was used, and we're very close. Remember, this just arrived recently, just at the end of last month. We're very close to determining actually which units used it during the Second World War. So it is about Canadian innovation because at that point, the United Kingdom, the British Empire were short of war materials, short of vehicles, short of weapons. And as Thorsten said, in a very quick turnaround, we had to move all of our industrial might, our know-how, to making those weapons, not just for us, but for our allies. Of all the vehicles that were produced in General Motors, Oshawa, only 29% of them were used by Canadian soldiers. 39% were used by British soldiers, and the remainder were given to Commonwealth countries, allies, newly liberated armies all across Europe and in the Pacific. So think about that. It's not just about Canada's contribution to protect its soldiers. It's Canada stepping up to arm and protect our allies and the world in our greatest crisis of all time. And that is an incredible story. The British had several designs, and they sent those designs over to Canada to see if we could copy them. But we did better than that. We took their requirements and we rebuilt a vehicle, re-engineered a vehicle to better standards that were more reliable, were safer for the crews inside, and also could be met by things that were readily available in North America. So a British version, the Humber Armoured Car, has a 37 millimeter main weapon. That was unavailable at that time. Those were going into light tanks. But General Motors was producing 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns. So in the Canadian version, you can see that the crew in the turret there have those 2 machine guns as their main weapon. You might also question this very interesting camo pattern. This was known in the Second World War as the Mickey Mouse camo pattern. That's not a joke, it's true, and I think you immediately can see why. There's no other vehicle in our collection that has this special camo pattern. We're actually in the middle of restoring another GM Oshawa vehicle, a CMP, or Canadian Military Pattern Hub communications vehicle, and it'll be put into the Mickey Mouse pattern so it can go around with the Fox. So here we're telling Oshawa's story, General Motors' story, but in Canada, Canada produced over 800,000 military vehicles. And as I said, only 29% of those were given to our militaries. Canada produced more military vehicles than Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and all of the minor Axis put together. Put that into perspective and how Canada stepped up. After June the 6th, 1944, with the invasion of Normandy, the Canadian forces were the most mechanized forces on Earth, with one vehicle for every 3 soldiers in the field. Right? Even our American allies, they had one vehicle for every 7 soldiers in the field. So it just shows you the mechanization that we were able to accomplish, not just for our armies, but for our allies during the Second World War. Now, in the next segment, I'm going to tell you where this came from and how it got here. And how it got here is an incredible story on its own. But it wouldn't have been possible without support from our donors. This museum, as you know, is funded by community contributions, donations, admissions. And we are very lucky to have some key donors who are helping us grow this collection. So I'd like to introduce you to Brad Dunkley of the Dunkley Charitable Foundation. Brad and Sarah Dunkley made this possible by donating the funds to purchase this vehicle and transport it to Oshawa. Brad?
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I did not work at GM, but I did go on a factory tour when I was in grade 8, and I drove here in a GM, so that's my connection. When I saw this on the internet, I think it was on the museum members group, somebody, I think it was Robin Craig, reposted that this thing was for sale in Italy, and I recognized instantly because I have spent many years here in Oshawa in the regiment previously, and also as a volunteer here at the museum, and I've known many people that have worked at GM and got to know this city, and I appreciate how much and how important General Motors is to the city. And also the fact that the Ontario Regiment is an armoured reconnaissance unit, and this is obviously armoured reconnaissance car. So I recognize instantly how much everybody here appreciates the history of this vehicle and how important it is. And I also believe, and you may have some experience with this, but I also believe that items of significance, and you can think of family, it doesn't have to be big giant things like armoured cars, but just medals and things that are important in your family. They have a way of finding their way to the right owner. And I think that's the case here. There's no place in the world that is better for this vehicle to end up in. My understanding is that the gentleman who restored this and cared for this vehicle, obviously you have to, if you met anybody who restores these vehicles, it is a labor of love. They put passion, heart and soul into it. It's not a business just banging out metal. And so my understanding is this person really cared about this vehicle and cared about where it ended up as well. And this museum, as I'm sure you all know, the people here are passionate. They really do care. They appreciate the significance of it. And I know that this is the permanent home for this place. It will be looked after. It will be treasured. It will be appreciated. It will be used to educate Canadians and people from the area about not just the vehicle and the people who served in them, but also, I didn't know that. That's an amazing stat that we produce more vehicles, our little tiny country, than the entire Axis powers. So anyways, this is a wonderful place, and my wife Sarah, who couldn't be here today, we've got one other son playing volleyball and another one playing football. So she couldn't be here, but this is just such a great place, and we're so happy that we're able to play a small role in helping this vehicle find its permanent home. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Without you and Sarah, it wouldn't have been possible. I actually thought it was impossible. One of the items that we have on display here, some historical material here about the Fox, one of them is actually a diagram, a training diagram that was given to troops. on where all the kit goes in the vehicle and where to stow it in the vehicle. And one of our members, Mike Rashad, contacted me and said, oh, I was at one of these military shows and somebody had this fox diagram. He thought it would be a great place for the museum. I said, Mike, we will never get a fox. That's impossible. They don't exist. It's a true story. And then, 3 weeks before Aquino Tank Weekend, which if you are in Oshawa, you probably hear it, if you haven't been to it, and it's a huge undertaking. We get a message from Brad, and it said, do you want to send somebody over to Italy to have a look at this fox? Of course, I was shocked and very pleased. Of course, yes, sir, we'll send someone over right away. But we had to keep it secret. We called it Operation Fox. Because when something this special goes on the international market, okay, there are millionaires and billionaires with huge collections that just scoop this stuff up. And it hadn't yet broken into those circles that this was available. So we had to keep it very secret. We didn't want to talk about it on the internet. We didn't even want to tell our members because it would also just lead to great disappointment if it didn't happen. So I contacted the seller. His name was Luigi Paletto. All right, and he had caringly restored this fox. And I said, well, can I, give you a small deposit just to hold the fox? And he said, no, we have a gentleman's agreement. I won't sell it until your man arrives. So it took another week for us to get Chris over to Italy. And Brad actually said to me, great on Chris, he's going to Italy for us, but make sure he has a day or two to actually see Venice or something while he's there. So we sent Chris. Luigi picked him up at the airport in Venice, and he never got back to Venice. He never paid for a meal. He never paid for a hotel room. Luigi and his group at CRCS Onless Museum in Italy rolled out the red carpet for him, and he didn't want to leave. So, yeah, he sent us pictures of their kitchen at the Italian Museum. Much better than ours, okay? And then they dropped him back off at the airport for his flight, and I couldn't believe it. He came back, and he had no expense report. So, thanks, Chris. Chris couldn't be here. He has a wedding to go to today. But he came back, he checked out the vehicle. He also made connections with that museum. And I've been talking to Luigi. I spoke to Luigi this morning. And we now have a connection between our two museums, between Canada and Italy, sharing information, stories, and obviously now a vehicle that came from there. Now, Luigi had grown up in a workshop in the 60s where his father worked on CMP vehicles, worked on Oshawa vehicles and Fords that were built in Canada, and he fell in love with Canadian vehicles. So he grew up with his father in a workshop. There's all of these vehicles, as we've heard, they never came home. So many of them were left in Italy, given to the military, given for civilian use, so the country could rebuild itself after the war. And Luigi's dad's shop specialized in looking after these Canadian-made vehicles. So Luigi fell in love with them. And then, as he got older and wealthier, he decided to start collecting them. And he told me the story about how his father had told him that when it comes to certain special artifacts, like Brad was talking about medals in your family, or giant things like this armored car, he said, you never really own them if you're a collector. You are really just holding on to them until they get to their forever home. And then I said, that's great. That means a lot. He understood the story about Oshawa. He understood the story about General Motors and about this machine coming home to where it was built. So then it was all agreed that we were going to buy the Fox, and we wired over the money. Now, in Italy, they have a lot of bureaucrats looking at international money transfers for terrorist support, money laundering, all sorts of things. So Luigi said the bank wouldn't give him the money. But he said, go ahead with the transport anyways. He says, we have a gentleman's agreement. So thank you, Luigi, for that. They held on to his funds for about 3 months, and we already had logistics lined up, and they were just stuck in the bank. And I was starting to get worried because Luigi was also being contacted by other collectors at this point. The news had got out about the fox. With only 7 in the world, and being very rare, and he was actually selling it to us at a very reasonable price, other offers and feelers were coming out to Luigi. But Luigi, even though he had not received his money, he said, we have a gentleman's agreement, and this fox is going to its forever home. So I just want to thank Luigi. We're recording this, by the way. And CRCS is a small museum in northeastern Italy, and it's a collection of collectors. So people who own military vehicles have come together with their collections and made a museum, and that's where this came from, CRCS Onlus in Italy. And as I said, we have one of Luigi's friends and members of the team at CRCS, Ilaria Deluce, is that correct? All right. Good enough. My Italian's good enough. Okay. And so she's here just to represent CRCS and see that the fox has made it to its forever home. So we're very grateful to Brad and Sarah, but also very grateful to CRCS and Luigi, obviously. So that's how it got here. Then there was an issue where, and we've had issues importing military equipment, you can imagine. There was an issue where the Italian government finally said, well, this is a piece of cultural property. You need a special EU permit to get this out of Europe. And I said, wait a minute. This is our cultural property. This is like sending the marbles back to Greece or other cultural artifacts back to where they belong. This is our story. This is our artifact. And there wasn't much argument after that. So it was on a truck to Belgium. It got to Belgium. They put it on a ship. From a ship, it went to Liverpool in the UK. And then it was transferred to Halifax. And I sent out another member, Ken Lee, and he went out, drove it off the ship into Halifax, onto a truck. It was arrived late last month. And then we tried to take it off, and it wouldn't start. Chris, you checked this out in Italy, right? It was just, if you work on classic vehicles, it was that old, just tap the starter, and it'll go trick. Okay, so that's why in the video that I released, you don't actually see it roll off the truck, Brad. Okay, so there's the story of a connection that we have with Italy today. The connection that obviously goes back before the Second World War, but the shared unfortunate experience of that conflict. And I know Oshawa has a lot of connections with the Italian community here and with Italy, but this museum now has a relationship directly with another Italian museum that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for this GM Fox. So that's the end of the formal presentation. I'm going to ask Mr. Alan Duffy to come back with some closing comments. But I really want you guys to appreciate how, regardless if you served in the military, you didn't serve in the military, you worked at GM, you didn't work at GM, in some way, your history is tied in to this object. So I hope you spend some time today getting to learn more about the General Motors Fox. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll be short and sweet. Thank you all for coming. Sarah, Brad, thank you so much. And let's hear it again for Jeremy. Does he know how to dig deep in the details? And if you haven't been here before, come back. We have a lot of stuff here. A lot of stuff to see. All right. Thank you all so much.